Imagine a scenario for a second. Imagine the most advanced, best-funded, trillion-dollar military on the face of the earth.
Right. Okay, I'm picturing it.
And then imagine that entire apparatus being effectively paralyzed by like 5 guys in a pickup truck with a handful of off-the-shelf drones.
Yeah, which sounds totally absurd.
Right. I mean, you'd think it was a rejected movie plot. But according to the explosive analysis we're doing a deep dive into today, it's not a movie. It's the current reality of global warfare.
It really is.
And even more terrifying, it's a reality that might be actively, draining the U.S. economy dry from the inside out.
Right. But before we go one step further into that specific scenario, I really need to step in here and lay down some incredibly strict ground rules for our journey today.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. This is a heavy one.
Very heavy. Because the source material we are dissecting today, which is a recent wide-ranging interview transcript featuring military commentator Doug McGregor, it contains some highly politically charged claims.
To say the least, yeah.
Right. It offers these intense, sweeping critiques of U.S. leadership, specifically focusing on Donald Trump and previous administrations, as well as Israeli leadership, namely Benjamin Netanyahu.
Right.
And it also makes these very definitive, often controversial assertions about the actions and the underlying motivations of nations like, Iran, Russia, Ukraine, and China.
And we are dealing with some incredibly heavy accusations in this text. I mean, it touches on everything from outsourced foreign policy to the deliberate sabotage of global energy markets.
Exactly. So I want to be perfectly unequivocally clear right at the top. We are not taking sides today.
No.
We are not endorsing these viewpoints, nor are we condemning them. Our only job here is to impartially dissect, report, and synthesize the intricate arguments presented in this specific interview transcript.
Right, we're just laying it out.
Yes, we are here to help you, the listener, understand the complex mechanics of the ideas being discussed. We are basically taking the machinery of this argument apart, laying the pieces on the table, and showing you how the author believes they fit together. So, you can evaluate the entire apparatus for yourself.
We are the guides, not the judges.
Yeah.
So here is how we're going to navigate this map today.
Let's hear it.
We're starting on the ground in the Middle East, specifically looking at the stalled Iran negotiations and the really gritty, uncomfortable military realities happening over there right now.
Okay.
Then, from there, we'll follow that geopolitical tripwire back across the Atlantic to uncover the hidden domestic economic crises allegedly brewing inside the United States.
Which is fascinating.
Yeah, we're talking inflation metrics, the structural integrity of oil reserves, and the really terrifying mechanics of liquidity trap. And then finally, we'll zoom all the way out to look at the macro picture.
The really big picture.
Exactly. A proposed 500-year historical shift of global power moving away from the West and magnetizing back toward Beijing.
It is a massive analytical scope. I mean, it demands that we constantly shift our perspective today from, the tactical view of a soldier on the ground to the grand strategic view of a multi-century historian.
Yeah, so buckle up. Let's start with the immediate crisis outlined in the text, which is the stalled negotiations between the U.S. and Iran.
Right.
The source describes this as an absolute roller coaster. But what really caught my eye was the claim about what the U.S. has supposedly already conceded.
It's quite surprising.
It is,
Yeah.
because we constantly hear about red lines in the Middle East, right?
Yeah.
But the transcript notes that the U.S. has actually dropped its major historical demands.
Yeah, pretty much all of them.
They are reportedly no longer making the Strait of Hormuz, which is, the most critical oil choke point on Earth, a primary sticking point.
Right.
They are demanding the dismantling of Iranian proxy militias, which they refer to as the axis of resistance.
Yeah.
And they've even allegedly dropped demands regarding Iran's ballistic missile program.
Which, if you understand the history of U.S.-Iran diplomacy, represents just a seismic shift in posture.
Yeah, it's huge.
What the source is claiming here is that the United States has essentially retreated from decades of hardline maximalist positions. The text argues that the American diplomatic machine has quietly acknowledged its inability to enforce those broader demands.
Wow.
So the only remaining sticking points outlined in the transcript are strictly transactional and very localized. Specifically, the unfreezing of $24 billion in Iranian assets, with Iran allegedly demanding $12 billion immediately and the remainder within 60 days.
Okay, so it's down to the money.
The money and, crucially, the ongoing volatile situation involving Israel and Lebanon.
Okay, wait, I had to push back here.
Sure.
If the U.S. has fundamentally dropped almost all of its major strategic demands, the missiles, the proxies, the straits, Why does the source suggest the deal is still fundamentally stalled?
That's the big question.
I mean, is it just domestic political optics in Washington? Or is the transcript alleging something deeper? Because McGregor's analysis makes a very specific, explosive claim about the relationship between Donald Trump and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu.
It does, and the transcript doesn't chalk this up to domestic optics at all. It makes the assertion that Donald Trump is, in the source's exact words, ultimately obeying the orders given to him by Netanyahu.
Wow, obeying orders.
Yeah. The text argues that Israel exercises a functional veto power over U.S. diplomatic actions in the region.
So the tail wagging the dog.
According to this author, yes. The underlying analytical argument here is that the looming threat of a massive regional conflict with Iran is being actively exploited. The source suggests that Israel is using the specter of this wider war to keep the U.S. politically tethered, financially committed, and, well, distracted.
Distracted from what, exactly?
From what the text describes as Israel's primary immediate objectives, which are finishing its ongoing military campaigns in Gaza and southern Lebanon.
Ah, I see.
The text actually uses the highly charged phrase, pursuit of the Greater Israel Project, to describe this core motivation.
Okay, that is an incredibly provocative framing.
He is.
But let's look at the mechanics of why this alleged veto power derails the negotiations. If the U.S. just wants to unfreeze funds and quiet things down, what is the insurmountable wedge here?
The analytical core of the failure, according to the source, comes down to a fundamental, irreconcilable misalignment of achievable goals.
Meaning they want completely different things.
Exactly. The transcript argues that Israel's base demand is the complete destruction of the Iranian state and the neutralization of its society as a regional power. They want a total eradication of the threat.
Right.
But the United States, despite possessing the most expensive military apparatus in human history, simply cannot deliver that specific outcome.
It just physically can't do it.
Right. So you have a situation where a global superpower is theoretically trying to negotiate a regional ceasefire, but is allegedly being vetoed by a regional ally that requires an outcome the superpower physically cannot manifest.
Yeah. Which opens up a massive question. I mean, demanding the absolute destruction of a sovereign state implies you believe you actually have the military, economic, and logistical capability to erase it.
Yes.
We tend to project our own values and breaking points onto other cultures, right?
Yeah.
We sit in Washington or London and say, well, if we face this level of sustained bombardment, our economy would halt, our society would demand a surrender.
We assume it's a universal law.
Exactly. We assume that's a universal law of physics.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not, is it?
No, and the source spends a significant amount of time breaking down this specific historical fallacy in U.S. strategic thinking, particularly the concept of decapitation.
Right, taking out the leader.
Yeah. The text traces a very clear progression of failed strategies against Iran. The first strategy, stretching back decades, was the assumption that the Iranian populace was constantly on the verge of overthrowing their own government.
So, stirring up a revolution.
Exactly. The claim is that Western intelligence agencies, the CIA, Mossad, MI6, poured resources into trying to stir up internal revolution, assuming the regime was inherently brittle.
And that didn't work.
No. According to the text, it completely failed. The government structure remained entrenched.
So when the covert internal revolution doesn't work, the playbook historically moves to Plan B, which is dropping bombs on the leadership.
Right. Plan B is decapitation. It's the belief that a nation's strength is entirely concentrated in its top-tier leadership.
Right, the head of the snake.
Exactly. The theory is that if you use precision munitions to target the high command, assassinate the top officials, and destroy the communication nodes, the entire societal structure will simply dissolve into chaos and eventually capitulate.
Which sounds good on paper, but...
But the source points out that this is a pervasive, almost religious expectation in Western military circles when dealing with the Middle East. It's the assumption that these nations are fragile, artificial constructs that will just shatter like glass if you remove the head.
But the transcript draws a massive bright line here. It explicitly states, quote, Iran is not like most states in the Middle East.
Correct. The source defines Iran fundamentally as a civilizational state.
A civilizational state. Let's unpack that.
It means it hasn't existed for just a century drawn on a map by European colonial powers. It has existed as a distinct cultural, linguistic, and geographic entity for over 2,000 years.
Wow. So it's deeply rooted.
Deeply. The argument the text presents is that you cannot simply bomb a 2 millennia-old civilization for a few weeks from 30,000 feet and expect it to structurally collapse. It's a profound miscalculation of societal resilience.
So the bombing actually has the opposite effect.
Yeah, instead of shattering them, the external pressure acts like a forge, galvanizing the population against the outside threat.
It's fascinating how the source contextualizes this modern miscalculation within a broader history of American military hubris.
Oh, absolutely.
Because I want to look at the timeline the text provides, because it's a pretty brutal assessment of the last 80 years of power projection.
It really is. The transcript takes us on a rapid, unsparing tour of post-WWII conflicts. It points out that despite overwhelming material advantage, the U.S. military ran into a strategic brick wall in Korea.
Which ended in a frozen armistice, not a victory parade.
Exactly. Then came Vietnam, which the source claims was characterized by no strategy, and ultimately ended in a chaotic disengagement.
But then, according to the text, something fundamentally shifted the American psychology.
Right.
1991, the Gulf War.
Yes. 1991 is highlighted by the source as the absolute turning point for American self-perception, and potentially the root of its current strategic crisis.
How so?
While the text describes Operation Desert Storm as a highly unique, anomalous situation, you had an enemy in Saddam Hussein's Iraqi army that was perfectly configured, rigidly trained, and statically positioned in the open desert to be defeated conventionally on American terms.
So it was almost like a tailored exercise for the U.S. military.
Very much so. The U.S. achieved a massive, lightning-fast victory, and simultaneously, the Soviet Union, the only other global superpower, was collapsing. So the conclusion drawn in Washington, according to the text, was absolute. We are supreme. History has ended. No one can touch us.
But that's the danger of outcome bias, right? It's assuming that because you won a highly specific battle under highly specific conditions, your underlying methodology is flawless and universal.
Precisely.
You assume the variables of the open desert in 1991 will apply to, say, the mountains of the Hindu Kush or the civilizational depth of Persia.
And that institutional hubris, the text argues, led directly to the resumption of unnecessary regime-changing hostilities in 2003.
Iraq again.
Yes. The transcript actually quotes the alleged underlying mindset from that neoconservative era, pushed by figures like Paul Wolfowitz, that, quote, the path to Jerusalem runs through Baghdad.
Which means what, exactly?
The idea was that to secure the entire Middle East, you simply start toppling regimes one by one using this invincible military machine.
Wow.
Which, as the source notes, led directly to 20 years in Afghanistan, and what it bluntly calls an embarrassing, ignominious withdrawal.
But to bring this back to Iran, and why the U.S. can't physically deliver the destruction that Israel is allegedly demanding, the source uses this incredible historical analogy that I think we really need to unpack.
The 1918 Brest-Litovsk negotiations.
Yes. Talk about that.
This is a vital historical comparison to understand the source's view on modern military limitations. To set the stage, Brest-Litovsk was the treaty negotiation that ended Russia's participation in World War I.
Okay.
You had the newly formed Bolshevik government negotiating with the German Empire. Germany had battered the Russian army, but the source points out a terrifying realization the German high command had during these talks.
What was it?
That Russia was simply too vast to be conquered. They were looking at an 1,100-mile front, 1,000 miles deep into hostile territory. The physical mathematics of occupation were literally impossible.
And the text applies this exact historical realization to modern Iran.
It does.
The unconquerable concept. It's not about how good your weapons are. It's about the physical limitations of mass.
Precisely. The source argues that to actually conquer, pacify, and control Iran, the United States would require a massive national draft.
Like millions of troops.
They would need to bring millions of young men into the armed forces. They would have to build entirely new logistical fleets just to transport that sheer volume of humanity across the ocean.
Which takes years and unimaginable amounts of money.
Right. And it would require the total nationalization of U.S. industry for a World War II-level total mobilization. And since absolutely none of those things are happening or are even remotely politically feasible in modern America, Iran simply cannot be conquered.
It is a geographical and demographic reality.
Exactly. The transcript claims the U.S. establishment refuses to accept this reality, which traps them in a policy of permanent, ineffective tactical strikes that achieve no strategic goals.
But holding ground and enforcing will requires an army.
Yes, it does.
And this is where the transcript makes a hard pivot. Because it argues that it isn't just the U.S. struggling to project force, The source asserts that Israel's military, despite being backed by the full weight of American logistics and intelligence, is facing a profound internal crisis of its own.
And this brings us to a critical distinction in military analysis: the difference between tactical success and strategic viability.
Okay, break that down.
The transcript makes the bold, really unvarnished claim that the Israeli Defense Force, specifically the ground combat portion, is, quote, effectively imploding.
Imploding. That is an incredibly strong word to use for one of the most celebrated militaries in the world.
Very strong.
What specific mechanisms or evidence does the source offer to justify a claim like that?
Well, the text cites several alarming indicators of systemic breakdown within the ranks. It mentions widespread instances of reservists simply refusing to show up for their call-ups, suffering from exhaustion or disillusionment.
So draft dodging, basically.
Or just burnout. It mentions active personnel leaving the service. And crucially, it points to a broad, systemic deterioration of military discipline.
For example.
The specific example provided in the text is the phenomenon of Israeli soldiers looting homes that have been destroyed in southern Lebanon.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. In standard military doctrine, when discipline degrades to the point of unchecked, widespread looting, it is often viewed as a glaring symptom that the command structure is fracturing and unit cohesion is dissolving.
That makes sense. And there's a really telling anecdote in the source from a former member of the IDF's Project 8200.
Oh, yes. The intelligence unit.
Right. And for the listener, you've probably heard of the NSA here in the U.S. Well, Project 8200 is their Israeli equivalent. They are the absolute elite, the best of the best when it comes to cyber warfare, signals intelligence, and decryption.
Right. And the quote from this former 8200 member, as relayed in the text, cuts straight to the heart of the crisis.
What do they say?
They allegedly said, Israel is great tactically, and they're great at killing people, but strategically, that's where they fail.
And this is the paradox we really have to explore. How does a technologically superior force, backed by global superpowers, possessing elite cyber units and total air dominance, find itself strategically cornered by militias?
It comes down to asymmetry.
Because the source explicitly mentions Hezbollah using off-the-shelf commercial drone warfare to cause significant sustained casualties to Israeli ground forces.
Right.
You have Israel pulling off these incredible movie-level tactical feats like the pager attacks that were widely reported globally, but strategically, the text claims Iran is emerging stronger, Hezbollah remains deeply effective, Hamas is still present, and Israel's ground forces are spread dangerously thin across multiple fronts.
This highlights the deep dichotomy of air superiority versus ground reality.
The air versus ground.
The source readily concedes that the Israeli Air Force is excellent. It is highly capable, brilliantly trained, and possesses an almost inexhaustible supply of advanced aircraft and spare parts.
Largely due to the U.S.
Right, due to that continuous logistical umbilical cord connected to the United States. But the stark, unforgiving warning in the text is this, quote, "You can lose the war quickly regardless of how good your Air Force is if you don't have an army."
Meaning ground troops.
Exactly. Wars, ultimately, are decided by the infantry. They're decided by the ability to physically hold ground, control populations, and enforce order. Air power alone can destroy infrastructure, but it cannot occupy territory.
It's the limitation of treating war like an engineering problem.
Exactly.
You can drop a precision munition down a smokestack from 30,000 feet. That's a brilliant tactical success. You can check it off a list. But if the people on the ground emerge from the rubble, more radicalized, more unified, and utilizing cheap, asymmetrical drone swarms that your multi-million-dollar defense systems struggle to intersect, well, the bomb didn't solve the problem. That's a strategic failure.
Right on the money. And the source argues that fighting these prolonged, essentially unwinnable ground conflicts isn't just draining Israeli manpower or degrading military discipline.
What else is it doing?
It acts as a massive, invisible vortex that is actively destabilizing its primary patron. Because funding unwinnable wars costs trillions, and that bill eventually lands right on the domestic economy.
Which brings us to the hidden crisis the source claims the U.S. administration is allegedly staring down right now.
Yes.
We're moving from the battlefield back across the ocean to the American economy. Because the transcript paints a terrifying picture, suggesting that the greatest immediate threat to the United States isn't in the Persian Gulf at all. It's quietly unfolding in the grocery aisles and at the gas pumps.
The transcript details a domestic crisis defined by inflation and trapped liquidity. It notes that U.S. inflation recently ticked up from 3.2% to 3.8%, with internal projections warning it could easily accelerate to 6%.
Okay, but 6% might not sound like hyperinflation to the average person.
No, it doesn't sound apocalyptic, but the text invokes a specific historical benchmark to explain why it is so deadly, and that's the Paul Volcker standard.
Okay, the Volcker standard. I know Volcker famously hiked rates in the 80s to kill the runaway inflation of the Carter era, but how does that historical math apply to the reality of the debt load we have today?
It's all about the mechanics of leverage.
Okay.
When Paul Volcker was chairman of the Federal Reserve, he faced double-digit inflation. His solution was brutal but effective. He jacked interest rates up to staggering heights, sometimes nearing 20%.
Which is insane to think about today.
It really is. This made borrowing money so expensive that it essentially choked the economic activity out of the system, causing a massive, painful recession. But it broke the back of inflation.
So how does the source apply that to today?
The source argues that if you applied Volcker's serious mathematical standard to today's real inflation metrics, U.S. interest rates should currently be sitting around 7%.
Okay.
But they are being artificially held much lower, around 3.75%.
And why is that? Why not just raise the rates and kill the inflation before it hits 6%?
Because of the debt. The source explicitly states that if the Federal Reserve were to raise rates to a true 7% today, given the colossal, unprecedented debt loads carried by the U.S. government, corporations, and consumers, it would, quote, crush the economy and destroy everything.
Oh, wow.
The interest payments on the national debt alone would consume the entire federal budget. It would trigger a cascade of corporate defaults.
It's an impossible systemic bind.
Truly.
You either keep rates low and let inflation eat the working class alive, destroying their purchasing power, or you raise rates to the necessary level and trigger a catastrophic systemic depression.
Those are the options presented.
So according to the source, if they can't raise rates, how is the administration trying to thread this needle and hide the inflation?
This is where we get into the physical mechanics of the global oil market.
Okay, break it down.
The source claims that the ongoing volatility and conflict in the Persian Gulf has effectively cut out roughly 13 million barrels of oil a day from the global market.
That is a massive systemic supply shock.
It is. And in a normal market, that shortfall would send the price of oil skyrocketing, which would immediately translate into massive inflation across every sector of the U.S. economy.
Because everything runs on oil.
Right. So to hide this inflation and artificially suppress prices, the text alleges that the U.S. administration is aggressively, quietly selling off the U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve, the SPR.
Ah. Draining the SPR to fight global inflation is basically like taking the airbags out of your car and selling them to pay for your gas.
That's a very good analogy.
Sure, it keeps you driving today and your wallet feels full. But the second you hit a pothole or an actual unexpected supply shock, the impact is fatal. You've removed your only structural safety mechanism.
That is the exact mechanical danger the source is highlighting. The claim is that the administration recently dumped 17.8 million barrels from the SPR, purposefully selling it below market rates, specifically to cap the global price of oil at around $110 a barrel.
That's wild.
And the source even alleges they are selling this below-market, subsidized oil to nations in Asia to compensate them for the economic damage caused by volatile U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East.
So we are bleeding our emergency reserves to subsidize Asian energy markets just to keep the illusion of price stability at home. How long can you physically keep that up?
Not long at all. The mathematics of the burn rate versus global consumption are unforgiving.
What's the timeline?
The timeline the text provides is deeply alarming. It projects that at this current pace of intervention, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve will hit rock bottom by July or August.
Wow. Next summer.
Yes. The source frames this not just as a short-sighted energy policy failure, but as an existential political and economic threat.
Right.
Emptying the reserve removes the final shock absorber.
Right.
Once it's gone, any further disruption in the Middle East will hit the U.S. economy instantly and at full force.
But the U.S. isn't operating in a vacuum here. While we are draining our reserves to manage the fallout in the Persian Gulf, there is another massive interconnected energy crisis burning in Eastern Europe.
Exactly.
And the source creates a direct causal link between U.S. actions in Ukraine and this broader global energy shortage.
The transcript asserts that the United States has been actively encouraging and assisting Ukrainian forces with targeting data, intelligence, and weaponry to attack critical infrastructure deep inside Russia.
Specifically the oil infrastructure.
Yes,
So
specifically, the text alleges they are using long-range drones, which the source notes are built with components manufactured in Western Europe to systematically strike Russian oil refineries.
now, on the surface, if you are fighting a proxy war, targeting an adversary's oil refinery sounds like a standard logical tactic to defund their war machine.
Right, it makes tactical sense.
You blow up the refinery, they can't sell the oil, they can't fund the army. But the source points out a massive, catastrophic, unintended consequence to the global system.
Right, because Russia is not just an isolated gas station. It is a primary load-bearing energy supplier to major global economies, including China and India. So by taking Russian refining capacity offline through these drone strikes, the text claims the U.S. and its allies have inadvertently created a 14% global energy shortfall that simply didn't exist before the strikes began.
14%. And this is where we need to pause and fundamentally redefine a word for the listener.
Okay.
Because when we say energy shortfall, the average person intuitively thinks, oh, it's going to cost me $5 extra to fill up my Honda Civic.
Right, they think of the gas pump.
But the source expands the definition of energy far beyond just gasoline for cars. It goes deep into the industrial supply chain.
This is a crucial foundational point in the source's economic argument. The text reminds us that energy in the global supply chain means industrial feedstocks. It means the raw materials required to produce sulfuric acid, it means helium, it means aviation fuel, and perhaps most critically, for human survival, it means fertilizer.
Fertilizer. That is the literal cornerstone of modern high-yield agriculture.
Right.
If you have a shortfall in industrial energy, you inevitably have a shortfall in fertilizer production. If you have a shortfall in fertilizer, crop yields plummet.
And if crop yields plummet.
You have a massive shortfall in the global food supply. Suddenly, a tactical drone strike on a Russian refinery isn't just about slowing down tanks in Ukraine. It mechanically translates into the exploding cost of a loaf of bread in Paris, in London, in Cairo.
Which leads directly into the source's analysis of what is happening in Europe right now.
Okay, let's talk about Europe.
The claim is that Europe is suffering immense, potentially irreversible economic damage because they have been politically cut off from cheap Russian energy.
It's deindustrialization.
Completely. Entire industrial sectors, chemicals, heavy manufacturing, automotive are becoming structurally uncompetitive on the global market. Or they're simply shutting down entirely because they cannot afford the energy inputs required to operate.
And when factories shut down and food gets expensive, economic pain always inevitably translates into political upheaval.
Yes. The text makes a very specific, impartial prediction regarding this dynamic. It suggests that the sheer weight of this economic suffering will force massive political realignments.
What kind of realignments?
It predicts that new populist governments will soon take power in Berlin, specifically mentioning Alice Weidel of the right-wing AfD party as a potential chancellor, and similarly in London.
Wow.
And the first order of business for these new governments, according to the source's prediction, will not be ideological, it will be purely pragmatic.
Meaning they'll want cheap oil.
Right. They will halt the war in Ukraine entirely, pull back from the U.S.-led coalition, and immediately seek normalized relations with Russia to buy cheap oil and save their collapsing domestic economies.
I really want to chew on the implications of that.
Yeah.
Are we looking at a potential fracturing of the NATO alliance simply because the economic pain of expensive industrial energy outweighs the political and ideological will to maintain a unified front against Russia?
Well, the source certainly implies that physical economic reality will eventually override abstract ideological alliances. When a highly developed nation is facing rapid deindustrialization and the impoverishment of its middle class, the text argues it will revert to basic survivalist self-preservation. And this 14% energy shortfall is framed in the transcript as the primary catalyst for an even darker, more immediate economic prediction.
Let's face that prediction head on.
Ouch.
Because this is the part of the transcript that makes you stop whatever you're doing and just stare at the wall.
It's intense.
The source alleges that privately, behind closed doors, The U.S. president is being warned by economic advisors that the global economy could shrink by 36% over the next 12 months.
To understand the sheer catastrophic magnitude of that number, the source immediately compares it to the Great Depression of the 1930s.
Right.
During the absolute depths of the Great Depression, the global economy contracted by roughly 20%.
Oh, wow.
So a 36% contraction would be nearly double the severity of the worst economic collapse in modern recorded history.
Wait, I have to stop you there. A 36% contraction isn't a recession. It isn't even a depression. That is an apocalypse.
It is an unimaginably large number.
The Great Depression was 20%, and we had breadlines and dust bowls. Does the source actually explain the systemic math behind a number that catastrophic, or is this just hyperbolic fear-mongering designed to shock the listener?
The source argues it is a mathematical inevitability based on the structural differences between the 1930s and today.
How so?
The text argues that the context of modern financial engineering makes that 36% infinitely more dangerous than the 20% drop of the 1930s. The major fatal differentiator is debt and leverage.
Okay, walk me through that.
In the 1930s, the United States was a creditor nation. It had practically no debt-to-GDP ratio. Furthermore, following World War I, the U.S. had demanded that its European allies pay their war debts in physical gold, meaning massive quantities of the world's gold reserves had poured into the U.S. Treasury.
So they had actual money.
They had a rock-solid, tangible foundation to absorb an economic shock.
Contrast that with the reality of today. The source states the U.S. debt-to-GDP ratio is currently sitting around 125% to 130% and accelerating. We have no massive gold cushion sitting in reserve, only a towering mountain of highly leveraged, interconnected digital debt.
And when an economy is that heavily leveraged, a contraction doesn't just mean a slowdown in consumer spending. It triggers an immediate systemic liquidity crisis.
Liquidity crisis. Explain that.
The transcript points specifically to the massive shadow banking sector and major asset managers. It claims that right now, behind the scenes, large private equity firms like BlackRock and KKR are facing terrifying situations.
How does a firm that manages trillions of dollars suddenly face a crisis?
It's an asset-rich, cash-poor scenario. These firms hold massive portfolios of assets, real estate, corporate debt, infrastructure. But when panic hits and investors try to pull their money out, these firms need cash.
Right.
They try to borrow cash against their massive assets under management to meet redemptions, but the banks, fearing a systemic collapse, refuse to lend.
So they're frozen.
It becomes impossible to liquidate assets fast enough without crashing the market. The text warns of a looming scenario where investors simply cannot access their money. It is a total instantaneous freeze of the credit and liquidity systems.
I want you, the listener, to really internalize how this plays out in reality. Imagine a Tuesday afternoon. The liquidity freeze hits. Businesses literally cannot access the short-term credit they use to process payroll.
Yeah, everything stops.
The digital numbers in your bank account might still be there, but the ATMs are empty, the credit cards are declined, and the grocery store supply chains, which operate on just-in-time digital credit, simply stop moving trucks.
We assume the grocery store will always have food and the ATM will always spit out cash because we've lived through 80 years of extraordinary stability. But it's an incredibly fragile, interconnected machine.
It is.
The source does not shy away from the horrific potential consequences of that digital illusion breaking. It reaches deep into history to make a point about the sudden fragility of seemingly permanent power.
What history does it point to?
It references the geopolitical earthquake at the end of World War I, specifically the window around 1917 to 1918.
Okay.
During a span of just a few months, 4 massive, deeply entrenched empires, the Ottomans, the Romanovs in Russia, the Hohenzollerns in Germany, and the Habsburgs in Austro-Hungary all ceased to exist. They evaporated.
Empires that had collectively ruled vast swaths of the earth for 300 to 800 years, just gone, evaporated into the immense pressure of total war and absolute economic collapse.
The transcript argues forcefully that modern Western regimes are not magically immune to this historical dynamic.
Right.
To drive the point home, it invokes the widespread revolutions of 1848 across Europe, the spring of nations, where seemingly stable monarchies were suddenly engulfed in continent-wide uprisings driven by famine, economic depression, and political disenfranchisement.
But 1848 was a long time ago. Does the author think it translates?
The crucial difference, the source notes, is that in 1848, the challenged regimes were still viewed by a significant portion of their populations as having some divine or historical legitimacy. Today, the text asserts, There is a rapidly growing sentiment across the US and Europe that the institutions of national governance have entirely lost their moral and practical legitimacy.
And then the source drops this absolute hammer of a quote from Vladimir Lenin. Every society is 3 meals away from a revolution.
It's a chilling thought.
Whether you despise the politics of the man or not, the mechanical reality of human desperation is universal. You miss 1 meal, you're hungry. You miss 2, you're angry. You miss 3, you are breaking windows and burning down institutions to feed your children.
To compound that fragility, the text highlights a stark, terrifying metric of modern economic reality. It claims that currently, just 10% of the U.S. population spends 90% of the money inside the consumer economy.
That wealth concentration is absolute.
Very much so.
When you have a society that top-heavy, and you introduce a massive sudden shock to food supply, fuel costs, and digital credit, the source argues you have engineered the perfect, literal recipe for systemic revolution.
Exactly.
Okay, so if the domestic economy is a heavily leveraged house of cards teetering on the edge of a 36% contraction, it begs a massive, unavoidable question about our military posture.
Right, how do we pay for it?
A crumbling domestic economy means the U.S. simply can no longer afford to build and maintain the incredibly expensive, exquisite weapons it relies on for global dominance. And this brings us to the next profound argument in the text: the asymmetry of modern warfare.
This is where the source delivers a blistering, detailed critique of the U.S. military-industrial complex.
Let's hear it.
The core argument is that the United States has spent decades and trillions of dollars building highly complex, wildly expensive weapons platforms that are fundamentally becoming obsolete in the face of cheap, asymmetrical, commercially available technology.
The transcript uses the Dark Eagle hypersonic missile program as a prime example of this dysfunction.
Right. Yes, it does.
The source claims the U.S. version of this missile costs roughly 10 times more than China's hypersonic equivalent and 4 to 5 times more than Russia's. Plus, our actual manufacturing capability to produce them at scale in a protracted conflict is significantly less robust than our adversaries.
We're building Ferraris for a demolition derby.
Yes, exactly.
And while pouring endless billions into these ultra-expensive, low-yield systems, the text argues the U.S. military has completely neglected practical, modern necessities.
Oh, quite.
It points out a glaring, potentially fatal lack of drone interception capabilities. Despite watching the grueling war in Ukraine for years and seeing explicitly how cheap first-person view drones have revolutionized the modern battlefield, the source claims the U.S. establishment has utterly failed to replicate those lessons or build adequate, cost-effective defenses against them.
But why? I mean, if the lessons of Ukraine are broadcasting live on social media every single day, tanks being destroyed by $200 drones, why is the most heavily funded military in human history ignoring the obvious reality of the battlefield?
The transcript points directly to the underlying economic motivations driving U.S. defense spending, what is broadly known as the pork barrel problem.
Ah, okay. The politics of it.
The source argues that massive platforms like the F-35 fighter jet program or the construction of colossal amphibious assault carriers are not primarily designed for optimal strategic utility on a modern battlefield.
So what are they designed for?
They are built because the manufacturing contracts are meticulously designed to send billions of federal dollars and thousands of manufacturing jobs to highly specific, politically important congressional districts in states like Texas, Washington, and North Carolina.
So it's a jobs program.
Essentially, the driving political incentive for lawmakers is to build massive, expensive legacy systems to secure votes, regardless of whether those systems are actually survivable against modern, cheap threats.
It's institutional inertia, driven entirely by localized economics. But the physical consequences of that corruption on a real battlefield are devastating.
To vividly illustrate this vulnerability, the text brings up an anecdote from Doug McGregor's own 1997 book, Breaking the Phalanx.
Okay, I love this part.
Nearly 30 years ago, he predicted a future scenario that perfectly encapsulates modern asymmetry. He theorized that a few men in ordinary pickup trucks, armed with relatively cheap, commercially guided cruise missiles, could park on a coastline, launch their weapons, and successfully sink a multi-billion-dollar U.S. amphibious carrier loaded with thousands of Marines.
And the military establishment was furious at that prediction at the time,
Yeah.
right? Because it invalidated their entire funding model.
They were outraged. But the source argues that history has already validated the concept of asymmetrical vulnerability time and time again.
How so?
It points back to 1991 during the Gulf War, an era we discussed earlier as the peak of U.S. hubris. The U.S. Navy was planning a massive, cinematic, amphibious landing in southern Iraq.
Okay.
But intelligence discovered that Iraq had deployed a handful of cheap, basic World War I-era sea mines in the coastal waters.
Sea mines.
Yes. The source claims it didn't fundamentally matter if there were 10 mines or 500. The mere presence of those incredibly cheap explosives entirely canceled a multi-billion-dollar U.S. amphibious operation. The risk-to-reward ratio was shattered by a few metal spheres filled with explosives.
That's insane. If billion-dollar naval fleets can be paralyzed by a few guys in a pickup truck or a handful of cheap sea mines or a swarm of off-the-shelf commercial drones, has the entire historical concept of power projection become economically obsolete?
That's the billion-dollar question.
How do you mathematically justify a trillion-dollar defense budget to your citizens if the assets it buys can be neutralized by an adversary spending a fraction of a percent of that cost?
You can't, especially when you factor in the realities of physical manpower.
Right, the troops.
The source draws a stark, unforgiving contrast in troop levels, noting that the U.S. currently fields a combat force of roughly 450,000 troops globally, while Russia, galvanized by the Ukraine conflict, now has over 1 million men under arms. The transcript bluntly states that 450,000 men, by the standards of history, is not an army. That's a gesture. As we established earlier, you simply cannot occupy territory, consolidate tactical victories, or control populations without massive, physically present ground forces.
So let's look at the totality of the board. We have an economy teetering on the edge of a massive liquidity crisis and historic contraction. We have an exhausted military stretched across unwinnable, strategically confused Middle Eastern conflicts. And we have a defense industrial base stubbornly building overpriced, highly vulnerable platforms because of domestic political corruption.
It's quite a list.
According to the source, this toxic combination of factors is exactly why the United States must fundamentally, inevitably pivot its global posture. Which leads us to the final sweeping argument of the text, the multipolar pivot, China, Taiwan, and the end of a 500-year era.
The transcript indicates that this harsh realization of physical and economic limitations is already starting to affect U.S. policy at the highest levels of leadership.
Really?
It notes a significant, quiet shift in rhetoric regarding Taiwan. The source claims that Donald Trump, viewing the situation through a transactional lens, has recognized the sheer logistical nightmare of fighting a high-intensity war over an island that is 100 miles off the heavily fortified coast of China, but 6,000 miles away from the primary manufacturing base of the United States.
The logistics of that are mind-boggling. Moving material across the Pacific Ocean while under threat from thousands of cheap anti-ship missiles.
Exactly. And the text mentions that U.S. weapons deliveries to Taiwan as well as promised systems to Japan and Europe are already heavily delayed.
Which just further underscores the severe manufacturing and supply chain shortfalls we just discussed. We can't even fulfill peacetime orders, let alone sustain a Pacific war.
Exactly. And the source argues that actively walking away from a potential war over Taiwan is actually the correct, rational strategic move for the U.S., though perhaps driven by harsh, unavoidable economic realities rather than purely diplomatic wisdom.
So cut your losses.
Yes. To understand why the source believes ceding this sphere of influence is acceptable, the text impartially outlines a very specific view of China's grand strategy.
This is a perspective you very rarely hear in mainstream Western geopolitical analysis, which usually frames China solely as an expansionist military threat.
It asserts that mainland China and Taiwan actually share the exact same ultimate societal goals and values.
Okay, what are they?
The source argues they both deeply desire to live in a highly secure, prosperous, and strictly ordered society, what the text describes as the Singapore model.
The Singapore model.
Right. It readily acknowledges that this model is far more restrictive, surveyed, and oppressive by Western liberal standards. But it argues that for the Chinese cultural mindset, collective prosperity and social order are the preeminent goals, fundamentally superseding Western ideals of individual liberty or liberal democracy.
And crucially, the source argues that China, unlike European empires, is historically not a martial invading country. It points out that the last time China attempted a major foreign military invasion, it was against Vietnam decades ago, and it ended incredibly badly for them. The argument the text makes is that China doesn't want to conquer the world with tanks and infantry. They want to be the undisputed gravitational center of global civilization, economically and technologically.
And economically, they have prepared for this shift. They are incredibly insulated compared to the fragile, leveraged West.
How so?
Well, while the U.S. is actively draining its strategic petroleum reserve to artificially suppress prices, the text highlights that China has taken the opposite approach. They are currently 86% self-sufficient in oil, and they possess the largest stored petroleum reserve in the world at a staggering 1.3 billion barrels.
Wow.
They have been quietly, methodically stockpiling resources, gold, and energy, while the West has been burning through its wealth fighting asymmetrical wars in the desert.
And this brings us to the grand macro-historical view that the source uses to conclude its analysis. It is a stunning, paradigm-shifting reframing of the timeline of human civilization.
The transcript argues that for the last 2,000 years of recorded history, China was the undisputed economic, technological, and cultural center of the world.
2,000 years.
Yes. They consistently produce the greatest concentration of wealth and innovation on the planet. The text claims this natural historical balance was only interrupted by a specific, highly disruptive historical anomaly, the year 1492.
Christopher Columbus. The discovery and exploitation of the New World.
Yes. 1492 unlocked the seemingly inexhaustible gold, silver, and agricultural wealth of the Western Hemisphere.
Right.
Suddenly, the economic focus of the globe violently shifted west, moving away from China, India, and the Ottoman empires. The immense stolen wealth of the Americas fueled the rapid rise of European colonial empires, the Industrial Revolution, and eventually American global hegemony.
But the source is making the profound claim that this 500-year Western anomaly is finally irreversibly ending.
Ending. Yes.
The New World gold is spent. The national debt is astronomical. The overwhelming military advantage has been completely neutralized by cheap, asymmetrical technology. And the geopolitical compass of the world is violently demagnetizing from Washington and London and magnetizing back toward its historical home in Beijing.
It's a violent return to the historical mean. The text argues that the U.S. essentially viewed the post-WWII era, the last 80 years of unquestioned American supremacy, as an open invitation to permanently garrison the world, dictate terms, and shape the globe to its satisfaction.
But that era of unchecked expansion has turned into a financial, logistical, and strategic nightmare.
Exactly. The source concludes that, much like the British Empire eventually had to accept reality and abandon India, the United States will inevitably be forced to abandon its forward operating bases across the Eurasian continent, in Korea, Japan, Germany, and the Persian Gulf.
Just walk away.
Not necessarily because they are defeated in a grand cinematic naval battle, but simply because the domestic economy can no longer afford the immense, crushing financial and political cost required to maintain the illusion of a global empire.
It's profound to think of history this way. We view the last 80 years of American hegemony as the absolute default setting of the world. We assume the rules-based order we built is the permanent, unchangeable architecture of reality.
Right.
But in the grand scope of 5,000 years of recorded history, it might just be a brief 500-year blip fueled by New World silver that has finally run its course.
If we synthesize all the threads we've pulled today from this text, a very clear, albeit dark, picture emerges.
Very dark.
The tactical failures of decapitation strategies in the Middle East, the rapid, desperate depletion of critical energy reserves to hide inflation, the extreme fragility of a heavily leveraged, debt-laden domestic economy facing a liquidity crisis, and the rise of cheap, asymmetrical drone warfare neutralizing trillion-dollar militaries. These are not isolated random crises.
No, they're connected.
The source views them all as deeply interconnected symptoms of a much larger, entirely unavoidable transition toward a multipolar world centered in Asia.
And this is exactly why we do these deep dives. Because this isn't just abstract, high-level foreign policy being discussed by men in suits in marble rooms in Washington.
It absolutely is not.
It is the literal physical cost of fuel at your local pump. It is the inflation driving up your grocery bill every single week. It is the stability of the digital supply chains you rely on to get your medicine, your technology, your food.
That thing.
The shifting of geopolitical tectonic plates on the other side of the world inevitably creates the economic earthquakes we feel in our own backyards.
Understanding the underlying mechanics of that shift, whether you completely agree with the source's bleak predictions or find them overly pessimistic, is essential for navigating what comes next.
Because the one thing the text makes abundantly, terrifyingly clear is that the current geopolitical and economic status quo is fundamentally mathematically unsustainable. The geopolitical X-ray machine is broken. The clean lines of the 20th century are gone, replaced by muddy waters, shifting alliances, and asymmetrical tripwires. We want to leave you with one final thought, something to ponder as you look at the headlines tomorrow morning and watch the markets react to the next crisis.
A final thought.
If the immense, unprecedented wealth and confidence of the last 500 years was built entirely on the West, looking outward, discovering new continents, colonizing, projecting military power, and shaping the globe in its own image, what happens to the internal psychology of Western society when we are forced, by sheer economic mathematics and military reality, to finally turn inward, retract our borders, and face ourselves?
It is a question of profound civilizational identity, and one that history strongly suggests we will have to answer sooner rather than later.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive today. Keep questioning the consensus, keep looking past the surface of the daily headlines to see the mechanics underneath, and we will see you on the next deep dive.